After binge watching Criminal Minds a few times in the background while I was working, I decided to stick on another procedural just to change it up a little bit. I've got no interest in NCIS, and I've never seen a full episode of Law and Order. I'm not really inclined to. CSI is actually how I said my first curse word. There was an episode where there was a bunch of ashes all over the crime scene or something, and someone wrote the word bitch in it. I had no idea what that was, what it meant, so I just kind of read it out loud to my parents and then asked about it. It was kind of actually a really cute moment. I vaguely remembered enjoying the show Bones. More so, I knew I liked Zooey Deschanel in New Girl, and I kind of figured that her sister would be similarly fun to watch. So that's what I went with. I stuck it on. Bones is a really interesting show. It follows Temperance Brennan, a forensic anthropologist and author who works in conjunction with the FBI, partnered up with FBI Special Agent Celie Booth. Bones strong-arms her way into getting to work in the field with Booth, and we stick with the duo as they go about solving cases. Some episodes have some really inventive gore, which I enjoy a lot, and sometimes the mysteries can be compelling. Of course, the bread and butter of the show are the characters and how they interact with each other. There's the will they, won't they between Bones and Booth, that thing every show thinks they have to have. There's the no-nonsense worry of Cam Soroyan, and there's the constant sass and motherly advice of the absolute best character on the show, federal prosecutor Caroline Julian. There's lots to talk about with it. You could talk about Booth's odd conservatism versus Brennan's strident liberalism. The two of them also represent faith versus science, heart versus reason, and how those things can intersect and bleed into each other instead of just clash. You could talk about how the show approaches adaptation. It's technically based on a series of novels by forensic anthropologist Kathy Reichs, but Bones isn't so much based on her namesake character from those books, but rather on Reichs herself. It's just a fascinating approach to adaptation that I'm really interested in. What I'm more compelled to talk about with the show, though, is what it has to say about the systems we operate under in the real world. If you were to take the US government at large and its criminal justice system specifically and lay them out on the examination tables of the Jeffersonian's medical legal lab, Bones the show would find the government's bones in disarray. The system is broken. First break. A cracked and corrupt cranium. Dr. Jack Hodgins is a forensic entomologist, a bug dude. When he first shows up in the series, his character is notably an angry little pest. Pest, bug dude, nice. Over the course of the show, like with the other characters, he turns more personable. He finds things and people that bring him joy, and he becomes more open about the things that make him happy. His anger still lies there beneath the surface. Sometimes it becomes a coping mechanism, as lovable Dr. Lance Sweets points out when Hodgins says that he hates everyone. Sweets points out that the way Hodgins dealt with the world was through believing in and pushing paranoid conspiracy theories. The government is hiding aliens, lying about JFK, committing and covering up atrocities. Hodgins' conspiracies are supposed to be lovable quirks. But then Bones does something really interesting. Some conspiracies start having truth to them. The government is corrupt. Now, of course, this is presented through fictional lenses, so you can just wave it off as primetime soap dramatics. But I want to take the idea behind those moments seriously. I mean, you can wave anything off in fiction and just go, it's fiction, it doesn't matter, and then there's just no point to analysis. I think analysis is fun, and I think it matters, so we're going to do some. In Season 5, the members of the Jeffersonian team are locked up in the lab by a government agency. They're told to determine the cause of death for a set of remains. Through various things, such as Angela Montenegro's facial reconstruction, it becomes clear to the team, and to us, the viewers, that the remains are most likely President JFK's. In the world of the show, there is a second entrance wound on JFK's skull that came from an entirely different angle. Oswald, in their world, couldn't have fired both shots. There had to have been a second shooter. The request to exhume Kennedy's body and publicize the findings fails in Congress. This is a mine of dramatics that plays into the American imagination. There are plenty of conspiracies surrounding Kennedy's death. When I was a kid in high school, very dumb, I started to document tracking deaths of a bunch of people involved and truly thought I was onto something. Oh, they gave him cancer. It's fun to be young and weird and a bit dumb, isn't it? This episode suggests a few things. First, some conspiracies are valid. Second, the government was and continues to be willing to cover things up. Third, there must be a reason the government would not want to reveal the truth. We can imagine charitably something like embarrassment or the social trust issues such a revelation could bring. We can uncharitably imagine it's because they do not want the truth to come out. Perhaps they had the lab inspect the corpse unofficially to see if someone could piece together the truth using only the bones, and if so, that might be a danger for them. Upon discovering that they could, they had to prevent a proper named investigation. That episode builds the foundation for future plot lines in the show. Importantly, it shows a segment of the federal government using force to sequester, threaten, and silence members of the public. Brennan's father, Max, is a career criminal who, along with her mom, had to flee Brennan's life when she was a child in order to protect her and her brother from rogue FBI agents that were after them. Through the storyline with Max, we discover that the deputy director of the FBI is a corrupt murderer. He attempts to kill Brennan's brother. Here, we get the suggestion that corruption occurs both on an individual and systemic level. Both of these instances combine to set the groundwork for the very odd, cool plotline surrounding the shadow government. Through a heavy and complicated system of blackmail, the US government in the world of Bones is run by a corrupt, hidden bureaucracy. Special Forces members kill their enemies, and when those members are themselves killed in self-defense, they're painted as these dutiful FBI agents killed by a rogue, criminal, and Seeley Booth. Judges and politicians both are bought by the system of blackmail. Security guards are undercover agents working for the legacy of J. Edgar Hoover. This, too, is very soap opera. Lots of primetime shows are just nighttime soaps. And of course, this evil cabal is defeated by chopping off the head of the snake. Defeating one man and collecting/destroying his stash of physical blackmail is enough to destroy this form of systemic corruption. Outside of a TV show, we know things are a bit more complicated than that. Elaborate structures of functional blackmail are going to create hierarchical ladders. Some people will know more than others. Some will be under heavier boots. Blackmail files will have backups, perhaps on the cloud or something, and submitting to blackmail in turn becomes a source for further blackmail. That's how you get compromised by foreign governments, for instance. When the storyline gets wrapped up, it almost forces us to question its determination on corruption. Over and over, it also forces us to remember the dark history of J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. This is a thing that more or less happened in this country's history. Reminding us of Hoover, his corruption, and the corruption he spread forces us to wonder about our current government, our current intelligence agencies, and the current levels of corruption that might be there. How susceptible are we to this sort of thing? Watching this plotline in 2024 brings to mind the Steele dossier, Trump, and the whole hooker urine thing. Senator Bob Menendez has his whole gold corruption scandal. I'm sure you can conjure up at least a handful of politicians throughout your lifetime who can, at minimum, be called sleazy on all sides. Now imagine those same politicians in a world where they cared about being seen that way. I know, wild, right? How many might have worse secrets? Question the motivations and cleanliness of those at the top, Bones tells us. There might be hairline fractures in the skull. Perhaps the stapes have gone missing. Speaking of later season plot lines around government corruptions, Bones has an Edward Snowden episode? An anonymous government worker known as the American goes to the press with details of the NSA spying on American citizens. Yeah, that thing that actually happened. The American infuriates Agent Booth, who views him as a traitor due to the sloppy release of US intelligence agents and assets, putting those lives at risk. That's a real critique that many people have had of the real-life Snowden. Here, the show reminds us that the US government is crafty, creepy, and often very cruel. This invasion of privacy likely would have continued unimpeded if someone didn't eventually leak some details of its existence. Hodgins finds the USB with all of the info on it and offers it to Agent Booth. Booth tells him to destroy it. This is odd. It has no consequences, so it's presented as a good thing. Is it that no one should have that sort of power? Or is it that some of the damages of the US government should not be revealed? You can assume it's coming from a good place, like you do when Booth says they'll reclassify all of the blackmail materials so that no one can ever use them again. But take a step back there. The Ghost Killer's crimes and her father's were part of this blackmail scheme. They were covered up and held over people's lives in order to get them to do what the shadow government wanted. While plenty of petty crimes, embarrassments, and general secrets were in the blackmail, so too likely were plenty of serious crimes, murder, theft, rape. Booth will often go after powerful people if that's where Brennan points him, but here, with the amount of evidence available to him, crimes are hidden away. This could be to protect the other blackmail recipients, the more innocent people. One crime investigated would put a cloud of anxiety over all of the others. Or is it Booth in the show saying that revealing some crimes, bringing justice for them, does not matter if doing so might truly do harm to the system? During the NSA episode, a contractor for the NSA captures the reporter who published the Americans' info. They want to know the source. They want the data. They want her to stop. Their contractor then tortures her. When this torture is revealed, the torturer is burned and discarded. The implication is that if Brennan did not discover this action, and if they did not manage to connect it to him, the government would have kept this act under wraps. They might have let it continue. They are fine employing a torturer. That is also not without precedent. The US has a well-documented history with torture, especially in regards to the so-called War on Terror and Guantanamo Bay. Do you trust the government to full-on quit the use of enhanced interrogation techniques because some of its use was brought out into the light? I'm not sure I do. There are plenty of shadows in this world, Bones says. Their version of our world has a whole shadow government. What happens in those shadows? It's an interesting yellow brick road for the show to follow. Despite being a murder show with lots of bones and rotting corpses, Bones is an ultimately hopeful show. Its main focus is on its characters and their ability to grow and change for the better, to love more fully, to heal from their past hurts, and to help each other heal. There's a sort of heavy cynicism here, though. Yes, I can always assume things are done more or less for dramatic effect, but we don't have to examine media purely through intention. Presentation, regardless of intention, is also valid. In Bones, corruption can be beaten. The shadow government is taken down. Max kills the FBI deputy director. Judges and politicians are brought down. But in the world of Bones, corruption is also never ending. When you take down corrupt individuals in the government, you find more. Then you find those unwilling to fight said corruption. Then you discover vast conspiracies. There are good people in the government, Bones says. There are Agent Booths. Only Agent Booth's faith in the system can lead to him allowing cruelty to go on, hidden from the public and not brought to justice. The cranium is cracked. Let's combine systemic corruption with individual corruption. Doing so gets us to the Gravedigger saga. The Gravedigger turns out to be a prosecutor who took on the case in order to bury and destroy the evidence. It also allows her to toy with and destroy the people who might otherwise catch her. Individual corruption. In the episode where she's caught, though, the show has a guess at its future NSA storyline. Agent Booth's brother, Jared, hey, that's me. He's a high-ranking officer in the military. After abusing his power to commandeer a corpse for the Jeffersonians team, he's the key to getting evidence on Heather Taffet. Jared Booth uses a military intelligence database that the show says has secret data on every single American citizen. The show doesn't focus on this here. This season aired in '08. Snowden dropped his album of the summer in '13. The latter seasons recontextualize this moment. The NSA spying saved Booth's life. The system is broken, says Bones. Sometimes that brokenness is good, says Bones. When you watch this show, do you think corruption is unending? Is our government at large a force for good or a force for evil? As a forensic anthropologist, Brennan has identified the victims of genocides and horrid war crimes. We're reminded of this part of her history every now and then. She really hits it home. She has seen vast horrors. Do not forget the cruelty people are capable of, systems are capable of. Cracks in the ceiling are how light gets in. Cracks in the cranium are how you strangle and destroy innocent lives. Second break. The fractured fibula of the FBI. Revelations about the dealings of J. Edgar Hoover broke one of the arms of society while conking it on the head at the same time. Yes, he created cracks of corruption on the cranium, but he also revealed the limits and horrid power of the right hand of the law. So let's talk about what Bones has to say about the criminal justice system. In the episode, we're introduced to the best character, Miss Julian. Brennan is in New Orleans identifying corpses following Hurricane Katrina. One of the men she was working with turns up dead. Brennan has lost some of her memory, with evidence that she was attacked. The locals pin her as their #1 suspect. So Booth calls in Miss Julian to help clear Brennan's name. Brennan wants to be forthright and honest with the investigators. That speaks to her general nature and assumptions about the universe, that truth is paramount and people want to seek it out. Booth and Miss Julian disagree, though. There is turmoil in this city, and they want to close the case as fast as possible. The locals do. When Dr. Soroyan first shows up, she and Dr. Brennan butt heads. Sometimes Soroyan aims to be an arm of the prosecution, finding the evidence to convict so-and-so who they want to convict. In contrast, Dr. Brennan tends to care specifically about where the evidence leads her, regardless of if it helps or hinders the prosecution. Between these two instances, Bones makes an argument that there are plenty of people involved in the criminal justice system who don't care so much about justice as a concept, but rather justice as a performance. Speaking of performance, there's an episode where Brennan serves on a jury. Everyone watches the trial on TV. A famous guy is charged with killing his wife. It's televised and made into a media spectacle. Dr. Hodgins asks his wife Angela if she's treating this as one of her soap operas. An OJ comparison is made. Suddenly, we're asked to think about high-profile cases. You can probably think of plenty over the course of your lifetime that have been treated more like TV shows or movies meant to entertain the masses than actual carryings of justice. We're reminded in courtroom drama episodes that beyond knowing the law and arguing their positions, lawyers work primarily as storytellers, at least trial lawyers do. It's a reminder that courts are not simply halls of justice. They are theatrical stages. Performances matter. Though she thinks he likely did it, Brennan views it her duty to vote not guilty in this high-profile case because there is a reasonable doubt the defendant committed the crime. There is a solid lack of evidence. Brennan is correct here. If the prosecution fails to do their job, the jury ought to vote not guilty, no matter their personal beliefs of the defendant's guilt or innocence. We should hold our government, our prosecutors, to the highest standards because we should want them to be the best. Not because we want the guilty to be beyond us, but because we want to make sure the innocent are not condemned. A witness for the case ends up being the corpse of the week, and it seems like the defendant killed him. Brennan laments that if she hadn't been on the jury, he'd have been convicted, despite the fact that the prosecution did not do their job. She's set on nailing him for the murder of the witness, despite where the evidence might point her. Here, Bones seems to say that holding the prosecution to the standards they're supposed to meet will let guilty people go free, and that this is a bad thing. And sometimes being led by assumptions of guilt rather than factual evidence can also be a good thing, the show says. A thorough investigation into a man on death row, Howard Epps, stays his execution. Investigating this thoroughly is the correct thing to do. At the same time, the show paints the delaying of his execution as a bad thing. He eventually breaks out and causes more harm. If they had not done their job, Epps would not have killed more people. What Booth and Brennan did in this episode, the show says, was undoubtedly the correct thing to do. And yet, that the justice system did not turn around and kill Epps anyway, it seems to say, was the wrong thing. Justice, it says, is more important than the system functioning how it is meant to function so that we don't harm innocents. Except, is it? Mistakes by Dr. Addy in the prosecution, as well as a story laid out by Dr. Brennan in the defense, allow her father Max to go free for a crime we know that he committed. He is a murderer who is more than willing to kill again, and you almost see him do it several times throughout the show. Again, the system lets a murderer go free. Here, it is painted as a good thing. In the episode with Brennan on the jury, we get further into a storyline where Dr. Soroyan has had her identity stolen. The case is not solved by the investigators assigned to it, but by Angela in her free time. Law enforcement does not have the time or resources, the two claim, to solve such cases. It makes you ask how many lives stay ruined due to a lack of proper investigation. The arms of justice are too weak to hold all the innocent above water and all the guilty accountable. Miss Julian offers a deal to Dr. Addy where they'll charge him as insane/incompetent, so he ends up in a mental health facility instead of in a gin pop jail, where it's clear that he likely wouldn't be able to handle himself. Dr. Sweets points out that we know Zach doesn't qualify for this. Here, Bones says that sometimes the rules of the criminal justice system must be bent in order to allow compassion to come through. It is capable of this, the show argues. Every now and then, the show gives us a highly sympathetic murderer. We watch them cry about what happened. Sometimes the show has the criminal justice system express mercy for them. Sometimes it's taken as a sad necessity that justice be enacted regardless. Is the law meant to bend, or would bending it break its cold and brittle bones? The show doesn't seem to have an answer for this. Back to the death penalty. The Jeffersonian and Booth arrest a man that the evidence leads them to, who seems like he's probably a serial killer. He's found guilty and is sentenced to death. But then they start to doubt. It becomes clear to Brennan that he was not actually guilty. New evidence has come to light. A new victim is found who matches the MO of the original murders. The team continues to bring evidence after evidence to a judge, hoping to stay the execution to allow for a thorough investigation, even if it reveals that he is actually at fault. She refuses. The show accuses her of using this man's life as a political stunt. Looking tough on crime would be good for her re-election campaign. This is, one of the dangers of an elected judiciary, the show seems to say. She's clearly wrong for this. Here the show says the cruelty of the system almost killed an innocent man. A deaf and mute girl is brought in under suspicion of having murdered someone. At the start of the episode, she's treated coldly by the DOJ through Miss Julian and by the members of the Jeffersonian. It takes Dr. Sweet sweeping in to make any progress towards treating this child, like a child who is innocent until proven guilty. Here, the show says the criminal justice system is often cruel and uncaring. When Brennan expresses deep compassion for a young boy who potentially murdered his brother, she's denigrated by Booth and the prosecutor. But she's correct. The show continuously shows that anyone is capable of great cruelty if given the right circumstances. It also continually says that law enforcement is unnecessarily cold and cruel. It asks how many more crimes would get solved and how many more lives could be saved from ruin if, say, the FBI and federal prosecutors were more compassionate. And caring about people is what the show really wants us to do. So it argues that the criminal justice system needs to orient itself away from the cold cruelty it often embraces. There are fractures on the fibula of the system, right? But then the show turns around and it smiles at the idea of violence. Third break, fractured tarsals. Howard Epps was a really compelling villain on the show. He provided a match for Brennan without seeming cartoonish. The actions of the team directly led to his actions. It's action consequence. Compelling storytelling. In his first episode, at the end of it, Brennan breaks his wrist during their last meeting at the prison. This is represented as a moment of badassery. Booth and the show sort of admire her for doing this. When Epps shows up again in season 2, both Booth and Brennan assault him, using his chains to slam his head against the table in the interrogation room. This is presented as something he deserved, a good action. Bones, like plenty of crime shows to be fair, is filled with moments where it celebrates extrajudicial violence. More than that, Bones seems to occasionally argue that in those moments where the criminal justice system fails, justice must be taken care of outside the system. If your arm is broken, you can still use your fingers to scratch back something good. For instance, when Booth is placed in jail for killing those assassins sent to kill him by the shadow government, Bones blackmails one of the corrupt federal judges. Acting outside of the system, she forces him to let Booth go. This is a good action, the show argues. Brennan says that the shadow government was hoping for Booth to die in prison. If she didn't do this, he might have died. It seems to say, if you must fight corruption with corruption, if you can, then you have an obligation to do so. So, Max Keenan kills the corrupt deputy director of the FBI, a man who was threatening the lives of Max and his children. The show simultaneously argues that Justice was bringing Max to trial, and Justice is also letting him go free despite knowing that he did it. One of the most disturbing episodes for me comes when an undercover cop is found murdered. After discovering a young woman with her leg amputated, bleeding, and in excruciating pain, Booth stops the paramedics from taking her and giving her pain medication and making sure that she lives. He lets her lie there and scream in agony while he interrogates her. He shouts at the paramedics, how dare they be more concerned with their patient than letting him try to get information out of her right then and there. If he waits, oh, that would be awful. How dare you suggest that he wait? This is a cop who's angry, and you gotta let cops do whatever they want when they're angry. It's a clear abuse of power. He tortures this young woman. Later in the episode, he threatens to throw a suspect down the stairs to rough him up. In the other room, Miss Julian pretends not to hear it. The system is corrupt. The FBI is willing to use violence and threats of murder to coerce subjects. This is fine, the show says. Booth is not made to introspect on his constant embrace of violence and his pursuit of supposed justice. A deadly disease kills victims in one episode. Dr. Vaziri gets infected while they're dealing with the remains. They bring the primary suspect in to see Aristu, and in order to get a confession out of him as well as the location of the antidote, Brennan injects him with saline and claims it's the virus. This is painted as a good act by the show. Assault people and make them think they will die if it brings justice. Booth and Brennan both are likely to punch a suspect in the interrogation room. In most cases, this is not seen to backfire on them or the investigation. One time, Brennan is subject to disciplinary hearings from the FBI. In the Gravedigger capturing episode, the team decides not to go through with torture time on Heather Taffet. But this isn't because the characters stand against torture or because torture is proven to be ineffective, morally wrong, and bad. It's because Swades points out that it probably wouldn't work on her specifically because of her personality. If she was the kind to respond to it, well, it probably would have been fine, the show suggests, to torture her because it would have saved Booth's life. Maybe they don't recognize that torture doesn't work. But it's bad when Max Keenan attempts to assassinate the Gravedigger. You must work within the system, except if you're already within the system. Then sometimes you must work for justice outside of the system, but sometimes you have to accept the limitations. When Brennan flees after being framed, her fleeing is a good thing. The system is shown as idiotic and cruel, easy to trick. Yet Dr. Soroyan, working within the system and following where the evidence leads, is presented as good. What is good? Fourth break. Sacred skeletons. I was planning on fleshing out the third section further for this video. I wanted to note every instance of Booth engaging in a form of police brutality or other less than legal actions taken by the characters that are presented as good for them to have done. But then I started thinking about the video I did on NSFW art and ContraPoints' video on Twilight. There's a lot to discuss and critique this show for. There's that label of propaganda I talked about in the Criminal Minds essay. What does Bones have to say about power, the system, and justice? In many ways, it suggests we must allow certain cruelties in order for good to prevail. Sometimes it suggests justice must be cruel. But I also want to give consideration to the fantasy of Bones. One episode leads Brennan and Booth to interrogate a local gang boss. At the elevators, he makes a move at Brennan and she knocks him on his ass. He then puts a hit out on her. Booth later misses a funeral so he can track this guy down and threaten him with a gun in his mouth. When I was Googling for examples of police brutality in Bones, this moment came up in comments, but not in a negative way, really. It was often presented as hot. Why? It isn't simply that he's protecting Brennan. There are plenty of examples of that throughout the 12 seasons. But this specific moment stands out to a lot of people. Perhaps it's because this is an example of how far he is willing to go for Brennan. He acknowledges this isn't an action of Special Agent Booth of the FBI. He makes clear that this threat comes from Seeley Booth, trained sniper who has killed before and is perfectly capable of killing again. He will abandon the system if it means protecting Brennan. What is the fantasy? I don't think it's actually about violence. The people who imagine being Brennan in this instance aren't longing for someone to stick a gun in someone else's mouth for them. It isn't about the police brutality of it all or the abandonment of justice. Just zoom out with me a little bit. This is someone willing to bring the wrath of a violent organization upon themselves in order to protect the person he loves. What is it like to be loved so much that someone would invite such risk for your sake? Zoom out even further. This is a person who says he will not only sacrifice himself physically, but spiritually for another person. He will give up his principles out of his love for her. He will sacrifice his very essence. What is it like to be loved so fully that someone would consume their own soul for you? So then, what is the fantasy of the show Bones overall? Textually, we have examples of police brutality. We have ineffective and actively hostile government systems and actors. We see how the justice system works and fails and harms people over and over and over again. Zoom out a little bit more, and you build the idea that some evil actions are good, actually. Sometimes the system breaking is good. Sometimes it must be rigid. There are no purely good or bad actions in the show. It depends on who you are. What team are you on? Are you a good or a bad person? That's what determines whether your actions are good or bad. Sometimes it's good to be cruel and violent. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's good to take down corrupt systems. Sometimes it's best to leave them be. It's a confusing mess of a skeleton. But what if we zoom out further? What is the fantasy? In Bones, at the end of the day, good wins. Skeletons can be identified. The corrupt can be beaten. Bad systems can be defeated by taking down one man. Love conquers all. Even when things can't be perfect, we still live and survive. The bad guys will be caught. Justice is possible and desirable. Success will come if you just hang in there. Love will come if you just hang in there. Cancer can be beaten. Explosions can be survived. Financial ruin can be overcome. Life-altering pain will not ruin you. The system can have compassion. We can grow and become better. In some ways, Bones is a deeply, deeply cynical show. Yet at the same time, its central fantasy is one of hope. When you watch Bones, you don't watch for the forensics. You don't really watch for the crimes or mysteries or drama. You don't watch to see what it says about systems or the government. You watch for the characters. You watch to spot the light in the darkness. Criminal Minds was a show thoroughly concerned with empathy. Bones, on the other hand, is concerned with the concept of hope. It aims itself firmly at the future. Booth, Brennan, and Sweets were all abused as children. They have to work through the pains inflicted on them, yet they firmly look to the future. We will live, Bones says. The fantasy of this show is that we can be happy. No matter the darkness, no matter the fractures to our skeleton, we can still sip from the milk of life. Our bones will heal. The remodeling will be beautiful. I've got plenty of critiques of Bones, and there are plenty of modes of criticism I think produce fascinating conversation around it. But I do really believe it's important to remember this too. Bones sells the fantasy that life is worth living. It sells the fantasy of good triumphing. Your skeleton is sacred. And if evil ever takes you, this show says that Dr. Temperance Brennan will be there to give you back your name. Hi! Join me over on Patreon. I'm currently reading through Project 2025, so I'll have a somewhat long essay on that coming soon. Expect something over Ratchet and Clank, Spring Awakening. So you get these essays earlier than everyone else. You also get early access to the table reads of my play, looks behind the scenes of all my art stuff. Also, follow me on social media if you want. I promise I'm even more cringe-worthy putting out my puns on Twitter. Listen to my musicals here on YouTube. I've got composer demos, and then read my plays over on the new Play Exchange, and buy my poetry collection, Butterfly Snuff, out on Amazon now. Okay, thanks. Bye!